Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Hall coming to you live from Jarvis Hall Studios. We're going to talk about blood vessels today. So this is Cardiovascular Lecture 1. We're specifically going to talk about blood vessels and the different types of them. So before we get into that, let's just remind ourselves, so far we've talked about blood, which is a specialized connective tissue. We have a liquid ground substance called plasma that's mostly water, as well as some solutes, and those three types of plasma proteins we've been talking about. We also have our formed elements, the erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. So let's always review a little bit before we head on. That's how the brain learns. So now let's actually talk about blood vessels themselves. The first thing that I need you to know and understand on a really deep level is that our blood vessels are like one-way roads, okay? So a one-way street. Blood does not go back and forth through the same blood vessels, through the same tubes. It's all a one-way circuit, a continuous circuit. Blood is constantly moving from the heart. When the heart pumps, it's going to move out into the body tissues. And so the pipes are the blood vessels that carry blood from the heart to the tissues are our arteries. The definition of an artery is a blood vessel that carries blood away from the heart and to the tissues of the body, right? Which just means the different parts of the body. So arteries are going to get smaller and smaller. They're going to branch out like the branches of a tree and eventually get to the smallest type of blood vessel we have, which are capillaries. And those are in the tissues, and that's where we're going to see a lot of the exchange of nutrients and solutes and gases. And then the blood is going to need to move back toward the heart, and so it's going to travel through veins. So the definition of a vein is that it's a blood vessel carrying blood that's going from the tissues to the heart. This is just another way to kind of visualize this system. So I've grouped heart and lungs together here because we're going to get into the anatomy and physiology of the heart and lungs a bit later. So for right now, we're just going to treat that as one unit. And so as blood leaves the heart and lungs, it's going to move into arteries and then smaller arteries called arterioles, eventually into the capillaries, then into small veins called venules, like little mini-me veins, and then into larger veins, and ultimately back to the heart and lungs. This is yet another way to kind of visualize what we're talking about. The biggest artery in the body is the one that is coming right out of the heart, that's bringing all of that freshly oxygenated blood from the heart and lungs and carrying it out to the body. That's called the aorta. It's going to branch into smaller and smaller arteries, eventually into little arterioles, into capillaries, then into venules, small veins, larger veins, and ultimately into one of two vena cava. So that's just another schematic. I'm showing you lots of schematics today so you can kind of understand what they're showing you. So this one is showing us that the heart and lungs piece is kind of up toward the top, and I'm treating that as one single box for now for today's lecture. But you can see on the right-hand side, the aorta. Let me use my highlighter here, right? So the aorta is the main blood vessel taking blood out from the heart. And then depending on where it's going, right, if it's going to the upper body, you're going to have different arteries that carry it there. This is a really interesting circulation here that we're going to talk about later. If it's going to the kidneys, it's going to be the renal artery. If it's going to the lower body, it's going to be another artery. So again, this is not an actual anatomic diagram. This is just kind of a schematic or a representation. The actual anatomy of our circulatory system or of our blood vessels looks a little bit more like this. What they've done is they've shown us the arteries in the image on the left and the veins in the image on the right. And you can notice right away that for the most part, arteries and veins are pretty similar and run together. So for the most part, if we have, for example, a subclavian artery, sub meaning under, clavian referring to the clavicle, so we have our subclavian artery right here and right here, we're also going to have subclavian veins here and here, right? Because every place that we deliver blood to, we also have to drain blood back from and get it back to the heart. So for the most part, arteries and veins are going to be in the same places, carrying blood to and fro, kind of like the eastbound and the westbound lanes of Route 94. And they will often have the same names, but not always. So as we learn the anatomy, be sure to pay attention to those times when they don't share the same name. This is, I think, our final kind of schematic of what's happening. So up here at the top, this is kind of the heart and lungs, which is then sending blood out through arteries. We see these little one-way arrows here, delivering oxygen to the tissues which need it, right? So the tissues are constantly using oxygen in the mitochondria through aerobic cellular respiration to make ATP. The tissues then create carbon dioxide as a waste product, and so the blood is then going to take that carbon dioxide through the veins back to the heart and lungs so that then we can exhale it out into the atmosphere. So now we're going to talk about each type of vessel in turn. So we're going to start with arteries and arterioles. So again, arteries are getting blood that is moving from the heart to the tissues. It's a one-way system, and because these are the blood vessels that the heart is pushing and pumping blood into, it's a pretty high pressure system, right? So about 120 millimeters of mercury of pressure, right? So that's higher than what your bike tire is, right? That's usually about 50. Or no, maybe that's pounds per square inch. Might be different units, so I'm wrong on that. I'll figure it out and I'll let you know. But it's a relatively high pressure system, right? Because you're getting the blood as it's being pumped. So that force of the heart contraction makes the pressure high. And that's good, right? Because we need to get blood to all the different tissues in our body, even if we're raising our hand up high, right? And we have to combat the force of gravity. If you're doing a handstand, you still need to get blood all the way up to your toes, right? So we need to have enough pressure to deliver the blood to where it needs to go. The other characteristic of arteries, besides that they are a relatively high pressure system, is that they need to be customizable. And that means that there are going to be different times that different tissues need more or less arterial blood coming to them because they need more or less blood for one reason or another. So we need to be able to customize how much blood is traveling through those arteries. And so they're going to have structures in them that allow us to do that, right? So things that might, so if cells need to make more ATP because they're doing more work, right, then we need to get more blood delivered to them so we can deliver more exercise or more oxygen, sorry. So when we're exercising, we send more blood to those specific muscles that are working. When we're digesting, interestingly, we also send more blood to our intestines. Those arteries open up so we get more blood delivery to the intestines. And when you're thinking, you actually send more blood to your brain than you do when you're just zoning out. We also, as you know from when we talked about skin and when we've talked about homeostasis, are going to control the flow of blood to the surface of the skin in order to regulate our temperature, right? So if we're too hot, we're going to send more blood to the skin surface so we can lose heat. And if we're too cold, we're going to constrict down those arteries and send less blood to the surface of our skin when we're cold so we can conserve our body heat. When we look at the structure of an artery, right, so kind of looking at the anatomy of an artery itself, here is a not very high resolution, but I liked this diagram of an artery because it's showing you the different layers. They've kind of telescoped them out. So the innermost layer, the inner lining of the artery is called the endothelium. Remember, endo means inner, and thelium just means lining, right? Like epithelium, right? But we call it endothelium because here it's the inside. And that inner endothelium is made of our friend simple squamous epithelium, right? So you can kind of see here those little fried egg looking cells, flat, but closely packed one against another, kind of curved around to form a tube. The middle layer is really interesting in arteries because it's going to have some elastic tissue, which allows it to expand slightly as the pressure wave of blood being pumped from the heart travels through it. So you may not realize, but when you feel your pulse, when you feel that little throbbing, that is your artery actually expanding as the pressure wave moves through it, right? So that's what a pulse is. So that's why every time you feel that little kind of swelling in your artery, that little bump in your artery, right? That's every time your heart beats. The other thing about the middle layer of arteries that's interesting is that it has smooth muscle tissue in it, right? So we have the elastic tissue and we have smooth muscle. And that is what can contract. And because it runs circumferentially around the wall of the artery, if it contracts, that's going to decrease flow through the artery because it's going to narrow it, or it can relax to open up and let more blood flow through the artery, right? So that's going to change flow rates, and we can also use it to change blood pressure as well. Finally, our third layer is just outer connective tissue that just binds everything together. So there's your anatomy of an individual artery. Arterioles are just mini arteries. So in the micrograph up above, we can see this artery coming down and then sending off little arterioles. Right? I think it's just such a cute word. Little arterioles, which are then going to branch into the smallest blood vessels, which we'll talk about next. So arterioles are just mini arteries. So arteries are prone to a number of different problems, some of which result in medical conditions that you've heard about. So we're going to take just a couple of moments to talk about what some of those problems are so you can have a better understanding next time somebody talks about, well, their atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries, right? What is that? We're going to talk about that. So atherosclerosis is our first one. So if you get any kind of disruption to your endothelium, that inner layer of simple squamous epithelium, little tears in that inner lining of the artery, that can trigger something called plaque formation. So plaque formation, which you can see in the images below, we've got a diagram of a cross section on the left and an actual photograph on the right, is you can see all of a sudden these deposits start building up inside the wall of the artery. So this is actually underneath that endothelium. And it's usually composed of various immune cells as well as cholesterol deposits. And if this continues over time, you can also get deposits of calcium. And the blood vessel can actually get hard and kind of crunchy if you try to squeeze it. So if you've ever heard of hardening of the arteries, that's what they're talking about. Atherosclerosis, this plaque formation that can develop in the arterial wall as a result of injury to the inside of the blood vessel. So what causes damage to that endothelium? What are the things that actually increase your risk for atherosclerosis? Number one listed here is hypertension or high blood pressure. If you think about it, having high blood pressure is kind of like overinflating your car tires. So if you know anything about cars, if you overinflate your car tires, it causes stress and strain on the inside wall of the tire because it's getting stretched too much, right? And that can cause little cracks and fissures and problems. So same thing with high blood pressure or hypertension. That increased pressure, that high pressure can cause damage to the inside of the blood vessel wall, that endothelial lining. High cholesterol is also a risk factor. If you have a lot of cholesterol around, it is easier for you to accidentally start depositing some inside the walls of your arteries, right? Tobacco and nicotine, so not just tobacco itself, but also nicotine, the active drug in tobacco, seem to increase risk for atherosclerosis as well. Well, not seem to, they do, like a lot. It's a huge risk factor. I don't know off the top of my head the cellular mechanisms involved in that. I just know it's a really true thing. Finally, diabetes increases your risk for atherosclerosis, and that's because when you have diabetes, you have abnormally high blood sugar levels, and those sugar molecules get accidentally incorporated into all the structures your body is continuously creating, including the inside lining of blood vessels, kind of almost like if you've ever done any woodworking, back in the days before we had the vacuum attachments to sanders, if you'd been sanding something in your workshop and then you wanted to paint something, little bits of sawdust would get into everything and mar up the finish, right? So that's what happens with diabetes, is that glucose molecules accidentally get incorporated into structures and it makes them brittle and more prone to breakage and damage. So these are the big risk factors for atherosclerosis. There are other things as well, but these are the big ones. So what can happen then with atherosclerosis is you get that damaged endothelium, you start building up some plaque. It initially starts as what is called a fatty streak, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. Because as you start to build up this plaque, and now you have an irregularity in the surface of the artery, you also have an impediment to flow of blood through the artery, therefore that gets exposed to more trauma because you have this kind of bump sticking up, and so the problem just perpetuates itself. So you can see how over time, when this plaque gets really large, it starts to obstruct the artery, right? It's basically clogging the artery, and it's much harder for blood to flow through it. So as this happens, you get decreased or sometimes absent blood flow to really important organs. So if this happens in the blood vessels that supply the muscle of your heart, then those muscle cells don't get enough blood supply, they don't get enough oxygen, they don't get enough glucose, and they die. And when the heart muscle tissue dies as a result of lack of blood flow, that is a heart attack. So you've heard about heart attacks. The technical word is myocardial infarction. That's when the heart muscle dies because of lack of sufficient blood supply, usually due to atherosclerotic plaque. If you have death of brain tissue due to blockage in the arteries from atherosclerosis, that is a major cause of stroke. If you have damage to the kidneys from atherosclerosis, that can cause renal failure. And if you have obstruction in the arteries that supply blood to the penis, that actually impairs your ability to get sufficient blood flow into the penis to maintain an erection. So that's why all those ads on TV for Viagra are aimed at older men, because they are more likely to have atherosclerosis, and what happens over time is you just can't get enough blood flow to the penis to get a sufficient erection. If you're wondering then how those medicines work, they actually work by forcing the arteries to open up wider to get more blood supply. Another problem that can happen with arteries is not atherosclerosis, but a narrowing due to contraction of that smooth muscle layer. So normally that smooth muscle is only going to contract when you need to decrease blood flow to a region on purpose, right? Or in response to the artery being cut, right? So that spasm of the blood vessel is one of the first responses to bleeding. But sometimes this can happen abnormally, right? And so that we would call that a spasm, right? Not a controlled, not an intentional constriction of that smooth muscle. Kind of like a Charlie horse, but in your artery. And so smoking and nicotine are risk factors for this. Atherosclerosis is also a risk factor for this. But then stimulant medications and drugs, right? So if you've ever heard that, oh, don't do cocaine, it can give you a heart attack, that's true, actually. because those stimulant medications can cause spasm of the arteries that supply the heart, for example. Even caffeine in sufficient doses can also cause arterial spasm and result in markedly decreased blood flow to whatever region is being supplied by that artery. Extreme stress can do this, and extreme cold. Interestingly, alcohol withdrawal can also do this. In fact, it's not infrequent that in college students, sometimes if they come into the clinic on a Monday morning after a weekend of heavy drinking, their blood pressure will be high because the smooth muscle in their arteries is contracting. So we actually see that not terribly infrequently. Usually not severe enough that it's causing death of any of their tissues, but significant enough that we can actually see it by checking their blood pressure. Finally, another medical problem that can happen, which is a disorder of spasm of smooth muscle in the arteries, is something called Raynaud syndrome or Raynaud syndrome. It's pronounced both ways. And so, as you'll recall, normally if you get cold, you're going to constrict and contract the smooth muscle in the arteries to decrease blood supply to the surface of the skin. In people with Raynaud's, this normal response is excessive and exaggerated. So they actually get, as you can see in this image, no blood flow to the surface of their skin and sometimes no blood flow to their fingers whatsoever. So this is an over-exaggeration of the normal response. For people who have this, it's really important to keep your hands warm because lack of blood flow like this can be damaging to the hand. So you want to avoid this happening as much as possible. You also, if you have this, need to avoid smoking or using nicotine because that will make this worse. So we go through our arteries and then to our smaller arterioles. We're eventually going to get to our capillaries. And capillaries are some of the most interesting blood vessels because that's where a lot of the action is going to happen. So here's another image where you can see kind of what a capillary bed looks like. So we say capillary bed, it just means this fine kind of network of capillaries that are spreading out to supply all the different parts of all of our tissues, right? I don't know why they picked the word bed, but anyway. So blood is going to move from the arteries into the arterioles, then into the capillaries, and then on the other side, right, it's going to go into the veins. So let's take a closer look at what's happening in the capillaries. The capillaries themselves are tiny. So we can see here in this diagram that they are only one cell layer thick, right? It's that simple squamous epithelium. And that's good because we need for easy diffusion of things from the inside of the bloodstream out into the tissues and from the tissues into the inside of the bloodstream, right? So the whole point of sending our blood out to all the different parts of our tissues is to deliver oxygen and glucose as well as some other things and to take away carbon dioxide and wastes like lactate. Right, so we need things to be able to move quickly across, right? So the capillary is the only place where diffusion of these really important substances can happen. The other blood vessels, they are too thick. You do not get any substantive diffusion across the walls of your arterioles or your venules. They are too thick. You need to get down into little tiny capillaries. On the left, you can see a micrograph of a capillary. So we have some erythrocytes squeaking through, right? You can see the capillary wall is here and here. This capillary happens to be, if you look, this should look pretty familiar down here. That is a skeletal muscle cell. So this capillary is actually traveling in between two different skeletal muscle cells. Pretty neat. So now we're going to talk into what is actually going on with the solutes when we get into the capillaries. Let's remind ourselves, diffusion is passive. It will happen on its own, requires no energy, requires no ATP. Mother Nature wants things to even out. So a solute, a dissolved substance, will move from a place where it's highly concentrated, right? It will gradually move down into a place where it is less concentrated. This will continue until the concentrations in the two are pretty much equal. Okay, so that's diffusion, movement of a solute, right? Glucose or oxygen. We also need to remind ourselves that diffusion can work in two ways. So the first thing I want you to pay attention into this diagram, I don't know if I said that right, but anyway, so the blue solute here is going to diffuse across into the lower chamber, which I've labeled as tissues, until the concentrations are the same on both sides of the capillary. This green solute starts off with high concentration in the tissues, will move across the capillary wall into the blood inside the capillary until again the concentration of the two things are equal. So it's a little counterintuitive to realize that when the bloodstream, for example, is delivering glucose to the tissues, not all of the glucose that's in the bloodstream is going to actually move into the tissues. Only about half of it will, because we're relying on diffusion. So it will only move across into the tissues until the concentration of glucose is equal on both sides of the capillary wall. Same thing with taking away wastes. We never take away all of the carbon dioxide. It only moves across until the concentration is equal on both sides. So now we're going to take a look at two specific solutes that are going to move from the bloodstream into the tissues and the cells, and two waste products that are going to move from the cells and the tissues into the inside of the capillary. So remember, small solutes can easily diffuse across and move down. So what we've got on the left here in the green box that I just animated is glucose, right, which is continually being used up by the cells of the tissues. So therefore, the concentration of glucose is going to be low because they're using it up. It's going to move out from the bloodstream into the tissues and into the cells. Same thing with oxygen. Cells are continually using it up, so the concentration is going to be lower than what's in the bloodstream. So it's going to leave the heme molecule of hemoglobin in the erythrocytes, diffuse across the capillary wall out into the tissues, and enter the cells. Glucose and oxygen both are going to be used for aerobic cellular respiration. Don't worry about all those reactions that are listed there. I just like their diagram, but those of you who've taken biochem or other advanced biology courses will find those familiar. All right, so there's oxygen and glucose. And then on the other end, which is just on the other hand, really. So carbon dioxide, which is being made as a waste product from aerobic cellular respiration, and lactate, which we sometimes make when we do fermentation, those are going to move out of the cell because they're going to be at high concentrations because the cell continues to make them, and diffuse across the capillary wall to the inside of the capillary and enter the bloodstream. So I mentioned this before, and I'm going to reinstate it, right? The capillary beds are where the action is. This is where all diffusion of gases, nutrients, wastes, movements of hormones, all of those exchanges occur in the capillary bed because the other blood vessels, their walls are just too thick. So this only happens in the capillaries. The other thing that's going to move is actually fluid or water. Will also move in and out of the bloodstream, across the capillary wall, in and out of the tissues. So let's talk about that next. Movement of fluid. Here we go. We already talked about the solutes. Now we're talking about fluid. So as I mentioned, it's going to move both from the tissues into the bloodstream inside the capillaries and from the blood inside the capillaries out into the tissues. And the direction of where the fluid or the water is going at any given time is going to be dependent on two separate factors. One is hydrostatic pressure and the other is osmotic pressure. So now I'm going to talk to you about what those are. So the first one is hydrostatic pressure. That's what our blood pressure is. That's the pressure of the fluid contained in that vessel, right? So when we're coming from the arteries, remember that's a high pressure system because you're getting all the force of the heart pumping that kind of pulse of blood through the tubing. So hydrostatic pressure, just the pressure of the fluid in the container pushing on the walls of the container, is high when we first enter the capillary bed, so at the arterial side of the capillary bed. So you can see in the image down below that what they've done to kind of recreate this idea of hydrostatic pressure is they're kind of using a plunger, right, to make pressure on the fluid inside the container. And what that does is it pushes fluid out of the blood vessel and into the tissues, right? So fluid is going to move out of the capillaries and into the tissues at the first part of the capillary bed, at the arterial end of the capillary bed, because hydrostatic pressure is high. The other thing that you can see in this diagram is that as this occurs, large things in the blood, like red blood cells and large solutes like albumin, stay inside the capillary. They're too big to move across. And so as fluid moves out and you still have all these other cells and solutes inside the blood, but now you have less fluid, the blood is now more concentrated than it used to be. Right? So now we have a higher concentration of solutes. So the blood becomes relatively hypertonic. So we start off now then, I'm going to use a different pen. How does this work? All right. With some hypertonic solution compared to the tonicity of the fluids surrounding the tissues. So now we have high osmotic pressure. And so osmotic pressure, we talked about that before when we talked about albumin, right? If you have a higher concentration of the solution, then water is going to move via osmosis into your container over here, right? So water then is going to move back in to the capillary until the concentrations of the two solutions are relatively equal. So this is happening at the venous end of the capillary bed and will tend to pull fluid back into the capillaries. So it's kind of almost like our tissues are subject to almost like waves on the ocean, right? So in the beginning part of the capillary bed, fluid is moving out into the tissues, and then towards the end or the venous end of the capillary bed, fluid is moving back into the capillaries. This is a diagram that kind of puts that all together. So on the left, we start off with the arterial side. Hydrostatic pressure is high, blood pressure is high. So that's going to push fluid out into the tissues. As that process continues, the blood becomes increasingly concentrated, osmotic pressure increases, hydrostatic pressure, now that we're getting farther away from the arteries, is decreasing, and so then fluid is going to start to move back into the capillaries as we come over to the venous side of the capillary bed. This is another slide that just describes that entire process, and I put it in here for you as a reference so it shows up on the outline version. Normally, these forces end up, for the most part, balancing out, right? So normally, as much fluid gets pushed out of the capillary bed into the tissues on the arterial side, normally almost all of that fluid, although not quite all of it, gets pulled back in on the venous side of the capillary bed due to the osmotic pressure pulling it back in. So overall, our blood volume stays relatively the same. There is a small proportion of fluid that stays out into the tissues, and it's going to drain through a separate system of tubes called lymphatic vessels. That's important for our immune system and something that if we have time, we'll talk about later. So let's talk about what kinds of problems can occur with those fluid forces in the capillaries, right? So hydrostatic pressure, osmotic pressure, normally they kind of balance each other out by the time you get all the way through the capillaries, but sometimes one of those is off and that can create problems for people. The first situation we're going to discuss is something with which you are already familiar. If the osmotic pressure is too low. So remember we talked about albumin as one of the 3 important plasma proteins. Albumin's important because it's very osmotically active. It helps to pull fluid, water, into the bloodstream and keep it there. So if you don't have enough albumin, right, either because of protein malnutrition, albumin is a protein, you need to be ingesting amino acids in order to produce it, some type of liver problem that makes your body unable to create albumin, or a kidney disease that causes you to lose albumin in your urine. If you don't have enough albumin, your osmotic pressure is too low, therefore edema will result, right? So edema is from leakage of fluid, excess fluid leaking out from the bloodstream into the tissues. So you might remember this image from before. This is a child's feet. This child has protein malnutrition, and so the examiner had just gently pressed their thumbs onto the tops of that child's feet, and you can see it leaves these really marked indentations, right? Because the fluids are just kind of like, the tissues are just kind of like sponges filled with fluid. Another thing that can cause edema is not just if the osmotic pressure is too low, but also if the hydrostatic pressure is too high. So usually this is if the hydrostatic pressure on the venous end of the capillary bed is too high. Right? So if we think about, well, what could cause the venous end to have too high of a hydrostatic pressure? And it's usually if there's some type of back pressure coming from the veins. So some type of blockage in the veins, as is probably the case with this individual, or if someone has some heart failure, so there's a backup in the entire system, so the heart isn't able to quickly pump through the blood that's coming to it from the veins, right? We can get high hydrostatic pressure, and that can cause fluid to move out and not be able to move back in because the hydrostatic pressure is still higher than the osmotic pressure at the end of the capillary bed. So if you see someone with edema like this in this image, and it's not a problem with production of albumin, it's not a problem with osmotic pressure, then it's probably a problem with too high hydrostatic pressure. So now that we've talked about the capillaries, we've talked about the movement of solutes and gases by diffusion across the capillary wall according to its concentrations on each side. We've also talked about the movement of fluid depending on the hydrostatic pressure, which is usually high only at the arterial end of the bed, and the osmotic pressure, which is usually high only at the venous end of the capillary bed. Now we're going to move into talking about those veins and venules. So venules are just small veins. So from the capillary bed, we're going to enter those smallest veins called venules. They're going to combine together to form veins, and then the veins are what take the blood from the tissues back toward the heart. Now, when we think about how that's actually getting there, right? We don't have little tiny hearts at the ends of each of our fingertips. We don't have little tiny hearts at the ends of our toes to push the blood back, right? So we don't have these little pumps pumping the venous blood back toward the heart. And so this is overall a really low pressure and passive system. So we're going to see some structural differences between veins and arteries because the venous system is a low pressure system. So here's the structure of a vein. They have 3 layers like arteries, but they're much, much flimsier. Their walls are much thinner than the walls of arteries because they can be. So there is an inner endothelial lining, just like with arteries, also made of simple squamous epithelium. And we do have a middle layer with some elastic and smooth muscle, but there's hardly anything to it. Veins are interesting. When they're empty, they're actually translucent. That's how thin they are. You can see through them, okay? So this middle layer is much thinner than arteries because we don't need to withstand high pressure. And something we're going to talk about in a minute with veins is that in order for them to work properly, they have to be able to be squished. They have to be compressible. Arteries are not easily compressible, but veins need to be. And then we have that third layer of outer connective tissue. And then just a reminder that the mini veins that are bringing blood directly from the capillaries are called venules. Veins also have a really unique feature. Because they're a low pressure system, there's a tendency for blood to want to flow backwards from time to time. And so we need to prevent that from happening. So veins actually have valves in them. You can see this little flap here, which will allow blood to move this way. But if it tries, I'm going to use red, if it tries to come back the other way, right, it's going to get stuck here, and it won't allow it to flow backwards. So I realize this picture isn't very high resolution. It's hard. Veins are small, right? But this is the valve right here. And so blood can go through this way. But if it tries to come back this way, the valve kind of almost is like a parachute that kind of poofs out and prevents it from doing that. So that's a really unique feature of veins. We don't find that in arteries because they don't need it. They have high pressure. There's too much traffic. There's no way blood could go backwards in arteries. But in veins, because it's a low pressure system, we need to enforce this one-way rule. So let's come back again to that idea of how is blood actually getting from the tissues through the veins back to the heart. So we call this venous return because it's the return of blood to the heart through the vein system, the venous system. So there's some interesting things to think about. So certainly gravity can help you out, but only for your head or your arm if you're holding it up above your head and above your heart specifically, or if you're standing on your hands, right? So if you're doing a handstand or a headstand, then gravity would help you get blood from your feet back to your heart, but it wouldn't help you with the rest. So we can't rely on gravity to do the job for us. There is a little bit of pressure still in the system. There's a little bit of pressure kind of transmitted through the capillary bed from the arterial end, but it's really quite low. So you can see I've grayed these out because they're not significant factors. And then finally, some siphon action from the heart pumping. So our vascular system, our cardiovascular system, is a closed circuit of tubes, right? So there is a little bit of siphon action that happens as the heart pumps. But again, that contribution is relatively small. So there's two important, we call them pumps, even though they're not actual pumps, that are going to help us with venous return. The skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump. So we're going to talk about each of these in turn. So the skeletal muscle pump. So you'll recall from when we did the muscular system that when a muscle contracts, your actin and myosin filaments are sliding over top of each other, which shortens the sarcomere, but it also makes it fatter, right? So the muscle ends up shortening and getting wider and fattening. And what happens is you have a vein located between different parts of a muscle or different muscles. And so as the muscles contract, they kind of balloon out and get wide, and that squishes the vein. And so any blood that is present in this section of that vein is now going to move in the only direction that it can, this way, because of the valves. So this is our skeletal muscle pump. When muscles contract, they get wider and thicker. That squishes the veins next to them. Blood will move in the only direction it can to get out of that region of the vein, and the valves make sure that it goes in the right direction toward the heart. And then when the muscle relaxes, the blood can't go backwards, again because of the valves. I'm going to reinstate, this is a major reason why veins have to be flimsy and compressible, is for the skeletal muscle pump to be able to work. If we couldn't squish them, then this wouldn't work. The other mechanism for venous return is what we call the respiratory pump. So we haven't learned about the respiratory system yet, but I'm going to give you a spoiler. When we take a breath in, our diaphragm, that big dome-shaped muscle that separates the abdominal from the thoracic cavities, moves downward. It's kind of like pulling the plunger on a syringe. It creates what we call negative pressure or suction in the thoracic cavity. And so that not only pulls air in through our air tubes, right, through your windpipe and down into your lungs, which is what we're trying to do, but that suction inside, that negative pressure inside the thoracic cavity also pulls blood through the veins into the thoracic cavity, where the heart also is located. So that was super handy. So that is the respiratory pump that allows us to help pull blood through the veins back toward the heart. Let's talk about a few problems that we can have with the veins. The first one is varicose veins. So what we see in the bottom left here is a normal healthy vein, right? When blood moves up through the valve during muscle contraction, and then when the muscles relax, the blood gets stuck because of the valve. If, however, your valves are floppy and not working well, as we see in this third picture here, then blood can go backwards and can cause dilated and enlarged veins. That's what varicose veins are. So this is more common in people who some people just have flimsier valves in their veins, but also anything that causes a lot of pressure and strain on those valves. So if you've ever been told not to cross your legs, this is why. When you cross your legs, you're compressing your veins and causing increased pressure and strain on those valves, and you are more likely to have those valves fail over time, leading to varicose veins. Another problem that can occur with veins, and something that we've already looked at previously, is something called venous insufficiency. So if the valves, not only in those superficial veins that we saw on the last slide that got varicose veins, but the really deep, big veins aren't working, then you get lots of back pressure, lots of increased hydrostatic pressure that causes edema. If that's happening because your big veins are also having problems with your valves, we call that venous insufficiency, because the veins aren't doing their job sufficiently. If that happens, our treatments are to try to increase the hydrostatic pressure in the tissues, to try to exceed the hydrostatic pressure in those veins. So if you've ever worked with an older person who wore compression stockings, or even had some of these inflatable compression garments, that's what we're doing, is we're just trying to squeeze the tissues to push some of the fluid back into the capillaries to try to overcome that increased hydrostatic pressure due to the venous insufficiency. Another problem that can happen with veins that's relevant for your age group is that sometimes if the blood flow in the vein kind of slows down because you're still for a really long time, such as if you have knee surgery is a really common risk factor for this and you can't really move your leg very much, or a long airplane trip is also a really common risk factor. If the blood kind of sits around a bunch and isn't flowing very well because you're not using your muscles, therefore you're not having a skeletal muscle pump, then sometimes blood that sits around can clot and form a clot. So what we see down here is a clot that has formed inside a vein. That's not normal. It shouldn't normally happen, but sometimes it does. That clot in and of itself can cause a blockage in the vein and cause increased hydrostatic pressure in the vein, right? And that's called a deep vein thrombosis, if it happens in a big vein. So because that can cause a blockage in the vein, that can cause increased hydrostatic pressure and therefore swelling and edema and pain in the part of the body that normally has its blood drained through that vein. The other thing that can happen that I need you to know about is that sometimes a piece of that clot can break off and travel through the veins up to the heart and lungs. If that happens, sometimes that clot then gets stuck or lodged in the lungs and can be what we call a pulmonary embolus, right? So that can be very dangerous because it interferes with your ability to get your blood oxygenated in the lungs. So we've talked about a lot today. We talked about arteries. By definition, they carry blood from the heart to the body tissues. It's a high pressure system, and we have it's customizable with those smooth muscle layers that can dilate and open up blood vessels or constrict and close them down. We talked about problems with arteries such as atherosclerosis and arterial spasm. Then we talked about capillaries, our smallest blood vessels, just one cell layer thick for their walls, the tiniest ones, and so that's where solutes and fluid can move across. Solutes are going to move mostly via diffusion, so things that are in relatively higher concentration inside the blood, like glucose and oxygen, will move out of the blood and into the tissues. And things that are relatively high concentration in the tissues, like carbon dioxide and waste such as lactate, will move out of the tissues and into the bloodstream. Fluid itself will move early in the capillary bed via hydrostatic pressure, will influence fluid to move out into the tissues. As fluid leaves the bloodstream and moves into the tissues, the blood becomes more concentrated. And so as we continue through the capillary bed, osmotic pressure increases and then pulls fluid back into the bloodstream. Finally, veins, by definition, carry blood from the body tissues back to the heart and lungs. It's a low pressure system, so they have very thin walls and they have valves to prevent backward flow. Blood moves through the veins toward the heart via both the skeletal muscle and the respiratory pumps. So that's it for blood vessels. I hope that was helpful. Let me know what questions you have. Thanks so much.